So, I'm Lisa, welcome to Taxi Talk, and I'm here with Gareth Bentley from North Yorkshire Council, who is the head of licensing, so it's a very responsible job.
Responsible. Hello, everybody.
So we've got a few questions for Gareth today. So, hi, and thank you very much for appearing, it's much appreciated. So, we've sort of wondered, with the current taxi and private hire licensing bill going through government, do you think that standardising regulations across the UK will benefit the trade, or could it risk overlooking local needs and challenges, do you think?
Yeah, so I've no doubt that a greater degree of consistency will help with fairness and standard setting. And it'll go some way to stopping people shopping around for the most advantageous local authority for a licence as well, which are definitely good things. There's a lot of stuff in there without a lot of detail at the moment, but strengthening safeguarding is in there, which obviously can never be a bad thing, and probably the most important thing that we ever deal with as a regulator. There's a lot in there about minimum standards, and I know there's been quite a lot of debate nationally, and I don't think
I don't like the word minimum standards, do you?
Well,
because that seems to indicate a minimum.
You can go above and beyond. So a minimum standard, by definition, allows a regulator or local authority to set standards that are higher than that, and suddenly you've not got consistency anymore.
Yeah.
So I know there's national concern over that, but then other people, particularly regulators, local authorities, argue that if we're not allowed to enhance and set our own standards to take our own circumstances into account, then there's a risk there with things like wheelchair accessible vehicles, for example. I know some authorities are saying, well, we've done so well with wheelchair vehicles because of the conditions we've applied.
But it wouldn't work somewhere else.
If we get absolute standards. So as a starting point, I think I am a fan of absolute standards. So you get that proper consistency.
Everybody's on the same level playing field.
Yeah. I think I do understand some of the arguments that come forward, which allow local authorities to perhaps add stuff to those. But I think, on balance, I'd probably go with absolute rather than minimum, just to make sure that the system works properly and can't be amended too much. Maybe a degree of flexibility, but not too much.
Yeah.
As I say, we need to see the detail. We've not really seen that yet. But I've raised the example of wheelchair accessible vehicles. I've battled long and hard to try and increase the wheelchair accessible
I've been in some meetings with you on those, yeah.
and it is an issue for wheelchair users, but not an easy issue to solve, as I think most local authorities will say. So I think there's some chance maybe to try and introduce something that gives us a more national steer in terms of wheelchair vehicles. And in North Yorkshire, as in other local authorities, home to school transport is a really important issue, and we use a lot of taxis to deliver kids to school. I think North Yorkshire Council spends in the region of £1 million.
It's one of the most rural councils, though, isn't it? And buses won't get to a lot of the places. Yeah.
So we've got taxis doing fairly big journeys and spending around about £1 million a week on home to school transport. So looking at some of the detail, particularly stuff like cross-border working that's been discussed, we need to be sure that doesn't impact on our ability to use vehicles from other places to deliver some of our school contracts, because we couldn't do it without.
Well, you get a lot that come from just over the border as well into our areas. I know we have Lincoln that come into various schools here in East Riding, so I think you still do need that degree.
I don't think we could service our need without, and that means...
I think that'd be the same with a lot of authorities, though, because there is a lot of schools in one authority and children in another, especially with the SENs, as you say. Yeah. You can't keep them all in one little,
I think we need to keep our eyes open to the detail and the consequences of some of the proposals. Clearly, enforcement of outright vehicles is a useful tool, and one that I think everybody would welcome. National database of licensed drivers and vehicles is a great idea.
I think that's brilliant.
Local authorities a lot of time checking people, and it'll bring great transparency for who we've got working in the trade. Greater consistency does it open the door for larger companies to expand. It probably makes it a bit easier for larger companies, which they will like. Will that be at the detriment of smaller companies? I don't know.
I think that's already happening in some ways across the country, though, because a lot of small operators are finding it a lot harder with the red tape that comes along and joining bigger companies. I get the feeling that in maybe 10 years' time, there'll be 3 super companies in the UK. I hope not, because I think the one-man band has a place, but I do think that could come along,
It's almost like a supermarket model could prevail, isn't it? These small shops start to suffer. So that's my answer to the first question.
Well, that's very extensive. I like that one. And the next one we've got is, how is the rise of app-based companies and new technology changing the way that licensing authorities regulate the taxi and private hire industry?
So we touched a little bit about that on the first question. And there's no doubt whatsoever we're seeing an expansion of large national operators using consistent brands and products, and smaller operators are starting to use them too. So you talk about apps, people often think about the big operators in this country, but smaller companies can now access those at a reasonable price. So it's not just the big operators. What I can say is it appears to me that customers like app-based bookings, particularly younger people or people who've been used to living in bigger cities, they're quite used to using them and like that way of booking. It can facilitate cross-border working, which is good for companies, but then again, there can be impacts on your local smaller operators. In terms of enforcement, app bookings have resulted in increased contact from the local trade concerned about the ways that the vehicles are operating in our local area. For a regulator, it's always pretty difficult to prove whether bookings are made in accordance with the law, so that's always a challenge that we face. But ultimately, I think we live in a technological era and things are moving forward quicker than ever, and I don't think that's going to stop. So app booking via phones, I think they're here to stay, and they will only develop further. And the industry and ourselves as regulators, we need to keep up to speed with that.
Yeah.
We need to adapt.
Do you think that taxis and private hire vehicles should be more integrated with the national transport network, which is a particular pet hate of mine, as you know, because I've mentioned it on a few things, with access to the same grants, funding and support? Because you get trains, buses, all get these, and taxis and private hire don't.
Absolutely, yeah. My first comment is that would be great, yeah. And I think it's a point that is often missed, that taxis are a really important part of our national transport system, but they kind of stand alone. But it's not always that simple in the way that we have to deal with them as local authorities, because the laws are very different. So I know national discussions have pointed towards taxi services being deployed in a more strategic way, and that combined transport authorities start to deal with that and reduce the number of licensing authorities. But I think people forget that the current licensing law focuses on the fitness of vehicles, drivers and operators. It doesn't permit the local authority to direct the way that vehicles are deployed. So under current proposed law, I've never been convinced that local authorities have the opportunity to be more strategic in the way that taxis are delivered. They're not like trains and buses where local authorities have a real input into the way that they work. Taxis, by the nature, are very autonomous. They're very individual businesses, and that's part of their uniqueness. So it's kind of finding that balance between not being regulated like the trains and buses, which are very regulated, but bringing some of that too without damaging the uniqueness of what taxis do and the flexibility you get from taxis. When buses stop at midnight, they stop at midnight.
And you've got your rural routes that are obviously declining, and a way to do that we thought would be a good intro would be like the school contracts, etc. The council could utilise them with taxis to bring people back from some of these more remote villages, that kind of thing.
Yeah, try and fill those gaps and not the vehicles running around empty. I think there's more work to be done on that for sure. I do think that taxis, as I said, are unique in their role, and I think they are often misunderstood when redesigning transport hubs and town centres. And I've spent considerable time over the years raising the case for taxis and making sure that appropriate provision is made. When transport planners sit and design stuff, I don't think they understand taxis. I think that's part of the problem. And
I don't think they understand roads sometimes. No.
Yeah. My experience is that you don't really understand how taxis work, and often that leads to them being put aside rather than dealing with a difficult problem, which isn't a problem because it brings a solution. And it's very true, like you say, there is no additional funding really available for taxis, and that does impact on things like wheelchair accessible vehicles, electric vehicles, charging point infrastructure. So I don't know what the answer is to that. I think it would be nice to have a more kind of strategic.
The wheelchair side especially, because I know you've championed that in meetings that we've been in, and if you could get grants for vehicles, more operators would be inclined to obviously use them. So and I do appreciate you championing us in some of those things with the wheelchair community. This question kind of is very similar to the last one, but in several European countries, because I do like travelling occasionally, we speak to taxi and private hire drivers as well as we can when we get somewhere, and they receive grants or subsidies. In some cases, they get the entire vehicle paid for by the government. Do you think that similar support in the UK could help tackle the shortage of wheelchair accessible vehicles and speed up the move towards EVs?
Yeah, I think that mixes up a lot of what we've already discussed. So in this country, taxis are very autonomous individual organisations, companies, even individuals just running their own vehicle. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect in other European countries where vehicles are provided for drivers, that there's an awful lot of contractual agreement in that, in the way that they are operating. That's back to how do we use taxis more strategically, and how do we treat them more like buses and trains and what have you. So I think it's very much linked with that. And we've already said, I agree, that in terms of wheelchair accessible vehicles, funding is going to be something that will help them, no doubt. I do think people will probably move to electric vehicles as government policy advances, prices become more favourable, and charging infrastructure and the range of the vehicles improve. And I think we certainly are seeing more electric vehicles in our fleet in North Yorkshire now, which people are, despite what the fears are about range, some people are managing to make them work at the moment. But it depends on your individual trade, doesn't it, and how you operate your vehicle. The biggest question, obviously, is where funding would come from. Local authorities are under increasing pressure to do more for less. I don't know of any funding that I can provide. I can't spend the licence fees on assisting drivers and vehicles. It's got to be spent on the licensing regime itself. So I can't unlock funds from my accounts, which I don't have anyway. I mean, we don't make money, so we haven't got any surplus to hand out. So that's the biggest question for me. I think we look again to kind of national policy,
central government,
and consistency. Let's not have an unfair playing field where one local authority perhaps has managed to unlock grant funding because they're part of a big metropolitan area, whereas some of the rural authorities, as we're seeing, are pretty disadvantaged these days in terms of funding, and consequently the trade would be as well. So we need a national solution if we're going to create bigger funding for taxis.
This one's a bit of a hot potato, I guess. What are the biggest compliance issues that you're seeing among drivers and operators, and what would you say is the best way for them to stay on the right side of the rules?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, safeguarding violent offences, they for us are always very serious and a worry. So we work closely with partners to identify and eliminate concerns. Training awareness, I think, is key. So all our drivers have to have training and awareness of safeguarding issues, for example. Drivers do see and hear so many things that can lead to early intervention into matters such as county line drug setups. They're out there on the streets all the time.
Yeah, I did my safeguarding course last week, and it brought up a lot of the county lines using,
So taxi drivers, probably more so, certainly than any other transport provider, but probably more so than any other kind of body in the country, are very, very lucky in that they do see a lot of what's going on in society in the back of their vehicle, transporting people about. So I think we need to carry on harvesting that more and more. And drivers, as we know, do have a lot of knowledge, and sometimes are reluctant to put that forward. So,
yeah, we've had that issue because when we've asked for help sometimes from the police with runners, which is one of the biggest, we always get the it's a civil matter. I've got that act down pat now. No, it isn't. It's blah, blah. But a lot of the time they don't get that on the phone. So then if my driver's had a runner and they've not been paid £50 and then the police say, can you help us with this? They're disinclined to do so because of the relationship. Yes.
We need to give drivers the confidence and the know-how to report things that don't look right.
Yeah.
And safeguarding people always say over-report, not under-report. We'll cast aside what's not relevant, and we'll sort the relevant from that, so don't worry about under-reporting. Powers of immediate revocation, obviously, really useful when we've got safeguarding concerns, and we do use that. In my experience, drivers do need to be conscious of what they say to customers, especially to children. Many of our investigations find that drivers are often engaged in misguided conversations with children particularly, and that can lead to complaint and investigation. And quite often, the driver's not done that with any kind of motive. It's just misguided, really. Just be careful how you speak.
I think you bringing that up actually is really, really good, because, I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years now, and we've had a few episodes where drivers have innocently said something that they didn't feel would be inappropriate. And I've been like, oh my God, no, that is really inappropriate. And you actually bringing that up now, I think we get a lot of drivers that listen to this, just a little bit of a thing.
Particularly with children. In terms of what the biggest enforcement issues that we deal with, in terms of volume, without a doubt, it's points on licences. They're there all the time in the background. So we have our own policy about 9 points being kind of our
Yeah.
normal threshold when you're triggered to have your licence reviewed. But that's the one we deal with most. How do drivers stay on the right side of the law? That's a good question. So my advice really is to behave like you've got royalty on board at all times. So if you've got a royal family in the back and you behave like they were in the back of your vehicle, that'll take you a long way.
That's going to go into our induction pack, I think.
We don't need guns and arm gangs.
Yeah, no, I think that will go into our driver induction pack. I like that. Okay. So we've got, if you could change one thing about the current licensing system, what would it be and why? So, that's a big question, that one.
I might be controversial on this. I've kind of always had this view. I've never really understood why we have a two-tier system of hackney carriage and private hire vehicle licensing in this country. It leads to regular tensions and it leads to complaints. Why we can't apply the same rules and opportunities to all vehicles, I don't know. And it doesn't necessarily mean convert all vehicles to hackneys, but creating a vehicle that's somewhere on the middle ground, that's kind of a hybrid between a private hire and a hackney carriage vehicle. I think we're the only country that operate in that way, and I guess it's all rooted in history.
Do you know, I've never noticed when I've been abroad. I've never even thought to notice between. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
I think it's rooted in history, but there seems to be a real reluctance, probably in various camps, to make any change to that. But to my mind, if you create brand new laws, why would you create two types of vehicle? Why not give everybody all the same opportunities? Yeah. We can argue about space on ranks and stuff like that, but that's why I say we need a kind of middle ground, really, that's probably between the two.
No, I like that one as well, actually. That just never occurred to me. No, not with me. It probably will be with some of our viewers, yes, because as you'll be aware, the hackney trade is sometimes at odds with the private hire trade, but it isn't something I'd ever even thought of. When you get off a plane and you see the ranks outside an airport, you just get a taxi. Yeah, I didn't think about it at all. I mean, I know there's the ride-hail apps. So last question for you then. Be honest about this. What's the funniest thing a driver's ever said to try and talk their way out of trouble?
So, rather than one, I've written down a few here. And
Go for it.
My thoughts before this interview. So, my most memorable one, I think, was a driver from Blackburn with a very thick Blackburn accent was asked by a subcommittee why he threw a brick through the neighbour's window. And he replied in a very honest and sincere way. And he was very honest and sincere. He didn't lie, just told the truth. He said that his neighbour was having an affair with his wife, so he put a brick through the window, and then he commented it seemed fair enough to him. And I've got to say, I did have a tinge of sympathy with him, particularly because of his heartfelt kind of his honesty. And he was pouring his heart out and explaining what had happened on that day and how he acted how he had. And that was one occasion. On another occasion, a driver was pulled up by the police and was arrested for having smoked cannabis in the vehicle. And his response was, it was my passenger smoking the cannabis, not me, even though the police test said very differently. So sometimes people just argue when...
I've seen those on the police camera action ones, yeah.
An older one, before ABS was fitted on all vehicles, one guy in an interview commented that his car had this new fancy ABS braking system, so it was safe for him to exceed the speed limit. And probably my final one that I will always remember years ago. It's not getting out of trouble such, but just a memory. When I was inspecting a vehicle and looking at the seating arrangements, because it was one of the SUV vehicles that were quite cutting edge at the time. So we got in the back of this vehicle to have a look at the seating arrangements, and the driver, who was a lady that was kind of properly larger than life, she plugged herself right beside me in the seat and looked me in the face and said, "Do you scare me?" And I paused for a little while and then said, yeah, you do a bit.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, and hopefully we'll get a chance to get you on the National Taxi Talk at some point with our CEO. Thanks very much, Gareth.
Thank you, Lisa. Cheers.